if we're willing to be with people and be present with them while they're experiencing something tough, that there can be some life transformation that can happen in that. And it really doesn't have anything to do with us at all. And I know that you all know that. It's our willingness to show up and be present, and then letting that other thing happen that happens when two people are together, since we're designed to be in community. Your church holds a special place in my heart because my mother was attending here for a brief time when we moved from Tulsa to Franklin, and it was after the death of my daughter Abigail. And I visited your church with my mother in a season of my life where I felt like, I don't even know if I can leave this house, let alone be in community with other people. I experienced a lot of warmth here and kindness. And in fact, I spent months in the hospital leading up to her death. And I know that Stephen ministers at that time, 20 years ago, prayed for my family as we were going through that experience. And so I come tonight not as some person that works in a hospice, not as a person who oversees a grief center or has the privilege of working with Laura to take end-of-life conversations into the community. I really come to the conversation as a bereaved mom and a person that's walked a complicated journey with grief for a long time. And so I want to admit that I bring that into the conversation. And tonight isn't about me, and that's not why I mention it, but I just want you to know that right off the bat, that part of what I'm going to share tonight is certainly from my own personal experience. And there may be even a little bit of bias in that. So I think it's important for us to say right off the bat that people experience grief so differently. And it would be really hard for me to represent all of those experiences in the short time that we're together tonight. So I'll do my best to talk about how things might be different for people. But I think it's important that we just recognize that there's a lot of me in this presentation. It doesn't represent everyone's experience. And it's okay if you're sitting there thinking about someone that you've walked alongside, or maybe your own experience with grief, and you think, felt a little bit different for me. And that would be expected and quite normal. So we welcome that into the room. And I would be happy to take questions as you have them, or I'll save a little time as well at the end. It's okay if there aren't any, but I want you to know in advance that I would love for this to be more conversational than lecture. So to get us started, I have to just acknowledge the casserole. Isn't a casserole great? Especially at this time of year. Now, I don't know many 20-year-olds right now, except for my own living children that are all in college. When I say it's casserole night, they might roll their eyes a little bit and think, what is that? Like, we would rather have new In-N-Out burger versus this one-pot wonder, as I call them. But in grief, we have to acknowledge that food plays a really important role and can be such a gift to people, both metaphorically and quite literally, as we fill someone's freezer with those wonderful casseroles after a death. I'm certain that you've all either given or been the recipient of food in the wake of a loss. Has anyone not had that experience? Yeah, it's very common, and particularly here in the South, it might be one of our go-to moves. And that's a really beautiful thing. So I just want to acknowledge the fact that for me to say beyond the casserole, next level strategies for helping grievers, it doesn't mean that the casserole isn't important, because it is. And sometimes if we're walking alongside someone and we see that they need food, and that's the one thing we can do for them, that's a really great technique. So it's not a criticism of our food-borne connections and grief. And yet, what happens when the casseroles stop coming? What happens when the freezer is empty? What happens when the doorbell doesn't ring? And a lot of grieving people that I've worked with over the last 20 years feel like that is when the depth of their grief really starts to pick up. And they begin to feel it. When there are less visits, less support, less cookies dropped off at the door. So what then can we do as we attempt to minister to people in that situation that takes our way of supporting them in their grief beyond what they're already getting? which is a lot of support right after the death, or maybe even before it happens, and not so much later. Why does our society struggle with this? Well, I think about what is actually a Buddhist philosophy, that if we knew how to suffer, we would suffer less. And this principle, I think, applies, I'm making a sweeping generalization here, but to the United States in general, where oftentimes, if something pops up in our life, we view it as an inconvenience. It is a problem to solve. It is something to get away from as quickly as possible. We're not necessarily taught in elementary school how to sit with suffering, how to get to know it a little bit, how to be present with it. That's why you all are so important, because you're the people that are willing to actually do that with other people. In my personal experience, I saw times where people didn't really know how to relate to me after my loss. They didn't know what to say, and most of the time they were well-meaning. They just didn't want to hurt my feelings or distress me. The fact of the matter was, I was already in distress. I knew exactly what had happened to me and how bad it was, and I could have really used someone to help me understand how to sit with my own suffering. So the first core idea in providing next level grief support is to be willing to do that. And I know that all of you are. As a quick refresher, but I imagine, as you've heard Laura and other people who work around the bereaved often, we have to acknowledge that the idea of having grief as a step-by-step process is not really the truth for most people and what they feel like grief is for them. So this is Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of what was really death and dying when she did her original research, then translated into grief. And oftentimes the people that we work with say, you know, I don't know what's wrong with me. I thought I was at acceptance. I've been trying to be really faithful. I've been praying a lot, but somehow I'm in anger. Like, what am I doing wrong here? And when we encounter people that think this is what their grief needs to look like, they might feel a little boxed in by that. So it's okay to use this framework, but we have to remember that no scientific study whatsoever would ever say that grief is linear with an end. And you all probably already know that. So we have to level set and acknowledge that maybe the type of care and encouragement we're going to give to people is going to go beyond the casserole, and it's going to go beyond these 5 stages. A theory that we use often in working with grieving people, both at a live hospice, at the grief center, in my prior work as a private mental health counselor, this is called the dual process model of coping. Who in the room is familiar with this? Okay, wonderful. Well, this is the work of 2 colleagues, Strobe and Schutt, and together they formulated the dual process model, and it goes beyond grief, actually. So what we see here is that there are 2 sides of that person's experience in suffering or pain or loss. There is a loss-oriented side, and there is what they call a restoration-oriented side. I want you to think for a moment about someone you have been with recently as you've been ministering to them. Can you think about their circumstance with grief and loss? And in viewing this model, where were they? Were they more on the loss-oriented side or more toward restoration? Someone who's really focused on the loss-oriented piece of their grief, they are going to be holding tight to their grief. They are probably going to be mourning in public in some way, shape, or form. Maybe they're visiting the cemetery, for example. They're going to be grasping for the relationship, the person, the thing that they're grieving. It might be looking at pictures, recalling memories, telling stories. Is there anyone that you're serving that every time you're with them, you notice they want to tell and retell and retell and retell the story of the loss. Yeah, they are loss-oriented, right? Restoration side, that person might be saying, I don't want to grieve, I don't have time for that, it's too painful, I'm just going to focus on work. I'm figuring out who I am now that my person died, I'm creating my new identity, I'm plugging into the world in new ways. They are restoration-oriented. Now to me, this is taking slight liberty from the original theory. I think that a lot of our work as grievers happens in the middle between the loss orientation and the restoration. We are stuck here, right? Because we want this, whatever that person, thing, experience is that we can't have anymore, and we can't get to it, we can't get it back, so we feel stuck here. And let me tell you what, for most people, this feels really hard. When we say things to them like, have you considered going to that new group so that you could meet people instead of being alone? Man, that feels hard. Have you considered that maybe something good could come from this loss? Let's look for that. That can feel hard. Those things often feel difficult because it almost feels disloyal. As if we're saying it's okay that that person died because now my life is this, right? That can feel really uncomfortable. And so what happens for many people in grief, and again, my own experience showing up here too, is that it's happening here in the middle, and this is what I call the messy middle. It is the new life beyond what you had with that person, thing, or experience that you can no longer be with. You'll hear grief people call it the new normal, and that's okay. But the word normal and grief are two difficult things to have in the same sentence as far as I'm concerned. It is the messy middle. It feels ugly, awkward, unknown, stressful, and like I said, maybe even disloyal. And so what happens is we bounce back over here, or we stay too long over here. The true work of grieving for many that you are working with is not to abandon this side and to be 100% here. The goal of your work in supporting this person in grief is to help them get more comfortable in the messy middle and to become more comfortable with bouncing back and forth. So I can use myself as an example. A few years after Abigail died, I thought, you know what? I only have so many pictures of her. She was an infant. Pictures are really hard to look at because they weren't as beautiful as I had hoped they would be. There's a lot of distress in those pictures, but I'm gonna put them out. And so I very proudly and confidently got into my special protective bin and took out pictures of Abigail and put them all over my walls. I was loss-oriented. A few months went by. I don't really remember what day it was, but boy, was I having trouble adjusting to my messy middle. And I thought, you know what? I love her, but I cannot look at one more photo. And they all went back in the tub. And I appreciate the chuckles. I feel very normalized. This is the pain of grief in the wake of a loss. And it changes. Sometimes I have a deep need to connect with her, to connect with that experience. And there are times when I'm right over here and I'm thinking, wow, look at my life now. Look at my living kids. Look at what's come from all of this. Most days, I'm 20 years out and I'm kind of flopping back and forth in between. This is such a wonderful framework that you can use, and it's described to someone. Maybe this is why you're feeling so flippy-floppy. The good news is this: most grieving people feel like they're moving back and forth really quickly right after the loss. But somehow, in some way, we are designed to integrate the loss into our lives. And the rate at which we move back and forth slows down. And there we get comfortable with living in the middle. But this can be an effective framework because then your grieving person knows, oh, you mean I don't have to be done with it because everybody says I do? You mean I can sometimes revisit the loss but also function in my life? Yes, that's what we're hoping that they'll be able to do. So it's a more effective framework, I would say, for most grieving people than that stage or linear theory of loss. One thing that you might have heard others talk about before that we discuss a lot is the use of euphemisms. Okay, so I'm among friends here. Those that you're seeing on the screen have nothing to do with death or grief, but we like to politely say things in our society, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But when we use euphemisms for death, when we're trying to support people in their grief, it may not be exactly what they need. So research would indicate that people need to hear the words died and dead. Does it feel easy to you to say the word died and dead? Thank you for your honesty. Yes and no. And sometimes it's situational, right? So I'm not here to say that using euphemisms is a bad thing. Euphemisms are truly rooted in our faith orientation in most cases. The number one euphemism used in obituaries in the state of Tennessee is went to be with God, the Lord, their maker, etc. That is a way of saying the person died. I think it's important for us as care providers to just mirror the euphemism that your griever is using, if they are. But I also challenge you to try using the word died and see how they respond to it. Do they bristle? Do they say, he is not dead, you know exactly where he is right now? Or do they say, thank you for saying that, no one's had the courage to say that word to me. So it may be freeing to them. So think beyond those euphemisms, and then platitudes are a tough one as well, especially I think for spiritual advisors and care providers, because it is the role to reaffirm their faith and their understanding or meaning making of the loss. So are platitudes helpful or harmful? Again, I think it depends on your audience. And it's important that we don't plant a platitude on someone else, but instead we follow their lead. So it feels a lot different if a week after my daughter died, someone says to me, all things have a reason and this is going to work out. And I might be thinking, well, I'm glad you feel that way, but that doesn't really touch my heart quite how I needed it today, right? But if I say, you know what, I don't know how this is happening, but I have the peace that passes understanding, and I think this is going to work out somehow. So much more meaningful when I lead with that. So imagine what you can do in your next level grief support if you hold off and let them come to that and let them say that to you, and then you affirm it. Yes, absolutely. It is awesome that you can think about it that way. So letting them lead is important. And then I have to just briefly mention the danger of at least statements. And I imagine you can already think of what those might sound like. So my daughter Abigail was actually a twin. And her sibling Evelyn lived. And so what at least statement did people say to me? At least you have one. Well, wonderful. Was I happy? Yes. And since I'm among friends, I'll tell you those 8 weeks I spent at the hospital waiting for potentially them both to die. Between me and my creator, my only request was, could I not leave this hospital empty-handed, please? That is more than I can bear. So that very thought was actually true to me, but it didn't feel good when someone else said it. So at least statements are actually minimizers, and we want to try and set them aside as much as we can. Again, okay if the person you're sitting with says that on their own, but we don't need to impose it on them. This quote says, hurtful words, actions, and inactions of family and friends can hinder grief and that a grieving person can remember them for years after the death. This is from a research study. But look at the word in bold. It's the inactions that hurt the most. Recently, I was working with a gentleman who said to me, all the people that I thought would be there have fallen off the face of the planet. And now there's just random people like I meet at the grocery store or I might connect with online, and they're showing up for me like crazy. What happened to those people? It's the inactions that make us feel our most vulnerable. And the reason for that is because we've had a loss already which challenges our sense of security in the world, or our faith, or our viewpoint about what life is going to be like. And we also have an added loss of the people that don't know how to show up for us. And boy, that's excruciating. So I want to encourage you that your next level grief support is 90% about not falling into inaction. It's about being willing to try to do something for them. It's about being willing to sit with them and not say anything at all. It's about being willing to sit there and say, I don't even have words for this, but I am here with you and we're going to do this together. Okay, so if you're thinking, I don't know if this is going to help them or not, well, they will teach you. They will probably tell you whether it helped or not, but we don't want to err on the side of inaction. And I know you all don't do that because that's why you're in this role. Viktor Frankl said, despair equals suffering without meaning. And this is something that really resonates for me in my own loss history. Let me get to that right here. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that meaning making in grief helps us deal with the messy middle. When we can make some sort of sense of it, or figure out how it fits into our lives, or have some sense of resolution with it, that meaning prevents us from falling into despair. And I saw some of your YouTube videos on your page. I know you all have talked a lot about suicide risk and understanding that. When a person feels that despair, it's a really dangerous place to be. So in grief, you already have someone that may feel like they are suffering a significant loss. We want to help them make meaning of the situation. But we can't lead in that. We have to allow them to come to it as they do. So things that we can say instead of platitudes, consider statements like, I don't understand it either. Man, I've been in this ministry for 30 years. I've walked with lots of people who have had loss. I feel close to God. I don't necessarily understand all of this either, but isn't it great that we don't have to? Is there a way we could discuss that and acknowledge it for what it is without using a platitude? Saying, I've asked the same questions too. I wish you weren't hurting. I wish there was something I could do to change it. I know we all do. There are no words for this is probably one of the best things that we can say instead of trying to find words that don't meet them right where they are. And then what I do know is, and as a spiritual advisor, it's really appropriate for you to be redirecting them and reorienting them to their faith. Habits of the heart, a colleague in the field years ago coined this term because oftentimes in grief, we continue to play out the patterns of that relationship we had before the person died. So, for example, it might be that a person experiences the death of their spouse, and they used to take their spouse to the radiologist every Thursday. And it's Thursday morning and that person wakes up and they know their spouse has died. What is their mind telling them to do? Go to radiology. It's Thursday. Some people think, am I crazy? What is happening to me? I know that my person has died. You know what that is? It's just a habit of the heart. Your heart is still in relationship with this person, and your heart is acting on that relationship. It can be a really useful term to someone who feels like, why am I still doing this? I should know that this is no longer a part of my life. So I have a small acronym for you to remember as you're working with the bereaved. It's intended to create this idea of that next level grief support, which is truly made up of very simplistic things that you already know. So I'm here to affirm what you already do. The P is for present and presence. So it is one thing to be physically present with a person, and it is a whole other thing to create presence. And we create presence by the way that we're connecting. So I can be in the same room with you and not have any engagement with you whatsoever. Or I can pause, I can look you in the eye, I can be intentional about my body language, I can lean into the discussion, I can show you that I'm enthusiastic about being here. We want to be both present and create presence. A is to attend with empathy. So we may be acknowledging the fact that their person died, and we might feel bad for them, but without signaling to them that we are empathic about their situation, we're not going to get very far. You all already know this. Empathy goes beyond sympathy, right? I like to think about empathy as being what cues me to go do something about it. It's one thing to just feel bad for the situation, but true empathy is saying, I can see what it might be like to be in those shoes, and wow, that's a lot. So attending with empathy means that we're reaffirming their experience as we're attuned to the conversation. And we'll talk more about what that looks like. Understanding uniqueness. No two losses will be grieved in the same way. No two people will mourn in the same way. The person that says to you, I don't know why this is stressing me out so much. I've had a lot of death encounters in my life, but this one feels different. Why is that? Well, we go back to the habits of the heart. The reason this one feels different is because this is a unique relationship. This is a different grief. So just because in one experience they encountered it one way, doesn't mean they will in this one. And loss is cumulative. So when we stack losses on top of each other, it becomes more difficult to manage all of that than maybe when it was just this. So we have to understand the uniqueness and how that person might express their mourning. Mourning being that external part of grief. Can you think back to when you were a child and when you encountered maybe your first death-related loss? Maybe it was a person, maybe it was a goldfish. It's okay, for the purpose of this thinking, it doesn't matter right now. Think back though, what did the adults around you do? What did they model for you with regard to what grief was supposed to look like? And I'm going to ask you to just raise your hand for one option or another. You'll kind of have to think about which one suits your circumstance the best. Everyone's is unique, so you might have a varied experience. But would you say on the whole, the adults around you really modeled grieving well for you? Like there were lots of rituals and they told you what it was going to be like when you went to honor this person, and they let you cry on their lap when you needed to, and they talked to you about what happened when you died. Raise your hand if you had that experience. Wow, okay, we have about 2.5 hands in the room. And so I don't even need to ask you to raise your hand. The rest of you, maybe those adults didn't quite tell you what to expect, what to do, what it was going to be like. We're protective of our young people, and we say, we'll close the door, you go watch a show or whatever that is, and we grown-ups will talk about the tough stuff. Yeah. So all of us as adults who grieve come from one or two or their own experience. I encourage you, as you're sitting with someone who's experienced a loss, to ask that question to them. What was it like when you were little and a loss occurred? Because that likely informed how they're grieving now and how they're even giving themselves permission to mourn. Understand their uniqueness. We want to provide support without steering. And I think this one is challenging because we go in on a mission to help this person feel stabilized, hopefully better, affirmed in their faith. But again, we want to let them lead in that process, and we need to be in it for the long run. We need to be able to say to that person, you know, if we need to be meeting for a long time together, that I am ready for that. Because grief is not something that we resolve overnight. And to affirm that and be willing to show up to support without steering them in that meaning-making direction is just critical. And then be ready to evolve over time. So what happens sometimes is that there's really great grief support and it falls off a cliff. I've already mentioned that a little bit. That happens throughout that person's lifespan. Our grief support has to evolve with them as they encounter the loss in new ways over time. So as you imagine, 20 years after the death of my daughter Abigail, I feel a little bit different. There are some new elements of my grief that pop up. There are some that I don't experience very often, but there are life milestones that happen that help it pop all the way back up to the surface, right? Just the other day, I was sharing a story and suddenly I was crying and I was thinking, wow, was that right there all the while? Like sitting right underneath my tear ducts? Because you would think it's been so long that maybe I would be unfazed by what I was saying. But it's always right there. So we have to make sure that we are willing to evolve as their grief evolves. These are general statements. What do we do specifically? I imagine this is a little bit small on the screen. Apologies for that. These are practical tools that we can try and put into place. The first one says to help reduce decision fatigue. And you all already know this. After someone dies, there are a zillion things to do and take care of. Business matters, legal things, money stuff. But what do people say to someone in grief? They often say, now's not the time to make any big decisions. Well, great, that's helpful, because here I am with like 52 decisions I need to make in the next 20 minutes, right? What we can do as care providers is to find opportunities to help reduce their decision fatigue. It basically means take things off the list for them. And that's where the casserole comes in, because we all know, well, they're gonna have to eat. And so at least I can do that. That's okay. That kind of at least statement is all right. Fill in the gaps so that they don't have to. You might even create a menu of support. It might be to say, here at our church, these are the things we can offer you. These are the resources you can go to. I imagine you already have long lists of ways to connect them to support people to reduce that decision fatigue. Help them engage in the rhythm of life. If this is a person that used to go golfing every Saturday and doesn't feel like he can do it now, well, maybe you could walk around the block with that person. So at least there's sun, and at least there's fresh air, and at least there's a rhythm to the week. Find those opportunities. Help with invisible burdens. These are things they might not be quick to say, like financial trouble, difficulty with their interpersonal relationships in their family, worries about their kids. Those are practical, tangible things that you can get involved with. Support their rituals, their practices as they grieve, or help them create them. Years ago, I was speaking in California, and it was a group of counselors, and someone came up to me during a break and he said, you know, I've been in this field for a really long time, and I've like buried hundreds of people in my office. Alarming, right? It woke me up a little bit, and I was like, sir, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that? And he said that he was working with a lot of people that felt like they couldn't practice rituals around the death. Maybe their person died far from home. Maybe they weren't able to be present because they're homebound, lots of different situations. But he was creating space to have a funeral, to eulogize that person who had died, and to create ritual around grief. Guess what? The word ritual sounds like scary, woo-woo, Eastern sometimes, but what we know through research is that people who engage in death-related rituals, they fare better in their grief overall. They have a lessened trajectory of pain in their grief. So rituals are really important. Help them find what's important to them. Support memory keeping. So they may be saying to you, you know, my sister thinks I shouldn't be crying this much, and this photo album really needs to go back in the bin. And that's your opportunity to say, then let's get it out when I'm here. So having those connection points are really important. And then also consider using a care plan. And so I have brought a template for you. And Laura, if you'll just hold it for now, then let me just talk about it and we can pass it out in a minute. Thank you. A care plan can actually guide you through what a time with a grieving person might look like. It has areas to kind of check the box on what their needs are. Now, something that happens for many grieving people is that they feel like totally out of control and like they have no say in the matter. And this horrible thing has happened to them and they didn't even get a vote. One of the best things that we can do for them in that case is to help them feel empowered. So you using this plan of the care plan with them, the two of you together can actually walk through that sheet and say, what are the things we want to work on when I'm here and I visit you? What are the areas that you feel like are causing you the most distress? How would we know if it got better? And so that template will walk you through each of those areas that you might want to discuss with them. So as we finish up, just a few notes on active listening and empathic listening. And this is something else that's going to take your grief support to the next level. And that is that active listening, what you all are doing right now, isn't enough for our grieving person. Okay, we need empathic listening. So what's the difference? It's really quite simple. Active listening is listening closely, intently, and I can see that from all of you, and I'm so appreciative. But empathic listening is affirming and validating. So it's not saying, oh, you shouldn't feel that way. Or, gosh, I've never heard anyone say that before. Or, ooh, that must be so terrible. It is simply nodding along and saying, wow, yes, tell me more. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so validating and affirming as you go. And you're thinking, Allie, this is so simple. And yet I tell you, this is what your griever's getting outside of their time with you. And that's good. This is what your griever needs from their time with you and others. So, big question, what should your face be doing when you're empathically listening? What does it look like to empathically listen to someone versus just actively be listening? What do you think?
Appropriate facial movements?
Absolutely. There's so many of you that have been doing it for me all night. See, I can tell you're more than actively listening. You're thinking, oh, she's up there, she's giving this information, she might be nervous, let me show her that I'm here, right? So we don't have to incessantly be nodding our heads, but it's lovely when we do. Another little trick is just this. It is a slight little angle. That's how subtle it is. It is a leaning in. It's a sitting forward. It is being fully open. Those are the ways that we model it, okay? And then a really easy, silly, but easy tip to remember. If you ever get stuck, just think about the hairy eyebrow trick. Has anyone heard of the hairy eyebrow trick before? Now, sometimes we think about hairy eyebrows being a really bad thing. I have those days myself. But if you ever get stuck and you think, man, I almost said a platitude or an at least statement and I want to be helpful, what do I do? I'm not even that good at it. I can only do one eyebrow raised. I can't do the other one. Can anyone do both? You're really cool if you can. You'll have to teach me how. Raising both eyebrows or one. Guess what that says to the person in a very subtle but studied perspective? It's saying, tell me more. I'm listening, I'm here, keep going. Okay, so think about that hairy eyebrow if you ever get stuck. I love this quote. It says, empathy is the grace note of empathic listening. I'm sure there are some musicians in the room, and you know what a grace note is. It's a flourish. It's a delicate moment. Is it mandatory? Is it written in the music by the composer? No. Do they know it will enhance the music if it's there? Oh, yes. So think about empathic listening as being that grace note of the support that you provide the grieving person. It's saying, I want to hear what you're saying, I understand your situation, and I want you to know that you're not being judged. So if you use that PAUSE acronym, if you consider using the framework of the dual process model of coping, if you remember the hairy eyebrow, you are going to be giving really next level grief support compared to what they're getting outside of their time with you. This last quote says, "Be messy, complicated, and afraid, but show up anyway." And what I love is that each one of you is already doing that, or you would not be here tonight. So just keep doing that. Be willing to sit with them when it's awkward and difficult, and you're not quite sure how to proceed. It's exactly what they need. Thank you.
Are there questions?
I have a quick question. When you talk about the due process model, I've had a care receiver that went to the restoration side, I think, very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Is that healthy? Or do you need that back and forth and to process the loss-oriented side as well?
Such a great question. So I'll repeat it just for the recording. She just asked, is it okay to be very quickly over on that restoration-oriented side? And I'm going to give you a frustrating non-answer answer, knowing that everybody is unique in their experience. Oftentimes, denial is a survival mechanism. The human capacity to compartmentalize might be what's keeping them out of despair and suicidality. So is it terrible? In some cases, no. But grief is like a barnacle. It is going to stick with them. And most people would say, if you don't tend to it, it's going to pop out worse later on. It's going to be more problematic, more difficult to resolve, more ugly. It's going to have negatively impacted other areas of your life. So staying over in that restoration side and not being willing to engage in their grief is likely not going to serve them well for the long term. So yeah, we really do want to help them start to balance. Now, there are some times when the loss orientation, we don't want to keep bringing a person back there, is when there's a high level of trauma. Maybe a lot of people say, oh, grief is just a form of love. Well, in some cases it is, but in lots of others it isn't, right? That person might have been really difficult, there might be abuse, there might be a real trauma history there, and in that case, the restoration side might just be safer for them. So what we look at is, are they willing to sometimes visit the restoration? Even if that's less than other people we know, we would want them to experience a little bit of both. But also knowing and acknowledging that they just may not have the emotional fortitude to do it quite yet. It's a really great question. Others?